Hello, my name is Aaron Cavanagh and I'm the founder and editor-in-chief of Post-Burnout.com. Post-Burnout.com is a culture website dedicated to venerating burnt-out artists the world over. This is our website's podcast where we publish full-length recordings of our interviews, which are sometimes the unedited versions of our site's articles and at other times are exclusives. If you're a returning listener, thank you for coming back, and if this is your first time listening, thank you for checking us out. We hope you enjoy and consider subscribing, giving the episodes a thumbs up if you're on YouTube, or giving it a rating if you're anywhere else. It really helps us out. Thank you. Alright, in this edition of PostBurnout.com interviews, we talk with Richard Blows, the founder and owner of the Galway-based independent record label Blowtorch Records. In this interview, Richard discusses forming the label and its reason for existing, his criticisms of the major label system, his background and learning on the job when starting Blowtorch during the pandemic, the Galway scene, how to run a record label, the artists on his roster, and much more. I also want to plug a showcase that Blowtorch Records is hosting. It's called West by Sound West. It's on May 1st at the Roisin Dove in Galway, and some acts who have actually either been on this podcast or been interviewed for the website are going to be performing, including Virgins, Savage Hearts, and Innuendo. Additionally, the band Adore, who will be on the podcast pretty soon. I did the interview with them last week at the time of recording this, so that should be coming up pretty soon, but they'll also be performing. In addition, you'll also have the Swedish Railway Orchestra, Nixer, Scattered Ashes, Nerves, and Some Remain performing. Tickets for that show can be purchased through the link in the description of this episode. Thanks and enjoy. Richard, that's going. Can you hear me okay?
Hi.
Hi, it's really nice to meet you. How are you?
Good, yeah. Yourself?
I'm very well.
Good.
Yeah,
Is it Aaron or Aaron?
Aaron.
Aaron, yeah. Okay, yeah. Nice to meet you, Aaron.
Very nice to meet you too. Yeah, I was wondering before, like, just to kick things off, if we get a little bit about, I guess, kind of your background, kind of like what music, kind of like inspired you, I guess, early on when you were kind of growing up.
I suppose what I don't know, a lot of people call indie music now. I know indie's not really a genre, but I suppose yeah, guitar-based music initially, things that were not mainstream so much, probably.
Sure.
Although, like, I mean, I love pop music. I'm not a musical snob. But then I got into electronic music, dance music. I was big into that in the sort of 90s, rave culture.
Hmm.
I kind of went off music altogether a bit in the early 2000s, to be honest, Aaron. And then, yeah, sort of back with uh, mm, just things that are a little bit different, not run of the mill. Um, I'm not really interested in the charts or anything like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, I have a broad taste. Let's put it that way. Yeah.
Was there anything like because you mentioned that there was a bit of a break there in the 2000s, was there anything kind of like that just wasn't like kind of capturing your interest, and what was it kind of, I guess, that sort of re-sparked that interest in music?
I think there was a couple of things. I was having kids in the early 2000s, so you don't have as much time, I suppose.
Sure.
I mean, I am a bit of a music obsessive, and I think when I didn't have time to kind of delve into things maybe quite as deeply, things didn't resonate as much. I think it was a pretty poor time for music. There was the indie landfill era, so
Mhm.
you'd kind of come to the end of the sort of heady days of the 90s, and you just got a lot of pretty crappy guitar bands who were riding on the coattails of sort of Blur and Oasis, like Pigeon Detectives, those kind of people, who I absolutely loathed. There was the whole new metal thing, which I loathed even more.
Yes.
And uh, dance music wasn't that great. And then I guess I don't know. I mean, Arctic Monkeys, Strokes kind of kicked it off again. They felt authentic, they felt genuine. Uh, they were based in a scene. I love music that's kind of based in a scene. That's what I love about Galway. There is a scene in Galway, but it's not a snobby scene. It's just there is an excitement here because
Yeah.
there are bands coming up who are being nurtured by the city in and write about the city, whence they come. And I felt that was the same with the Strokes, same with Arctic Monkeys. And I suppose, yeah, that maybe that was what kicked it off again.
It's interesting the kind of Galway music scene because uh, I think in a lot of ways, like for like kind of domestic acts, it's like one of the biggest cities to kind of play, but I think it often gets skipped a lot by kind of like touring international acts. I don't know, like do you think there's within Galway there's a good opportunity to actually see a plethora of artists international and domestic, or how do you feel, like, I guess, about just the opportunities, what there is to actually kind of go and see in Galway?
There's loads to do in Galway. I mean, it's not just music. I mean, it's a huge arts city,
Yeah.
and there is a thriving, not underground, but a thriving scene for local bands, local up and coming bands. There didn't used to be. That really started from when Turnstiles, who were a punk band here, sort of about 5 years ago. So I managed Turnstiles because Luke the drummer is my nephew. Well, it's actually my wife's nephew, but we're kind of related. So they started the Freehouse series of gigs, which were based in Galway's Oris na Gael, and it wasn't Freehouse didn't really allude to the fact that it was free. It was more like that anybody could play, but it actually was free in as well. And so, a local band who might have just started and they might only have 4 songs could rock up with their guitars, keyboards, whatever, and play their 4 songs. And that was their introduction to the live music scene. And that route wasn't available before Turnstile started Freehouse. Mainly the scene, the music scene, there was a lot of sort of covers bands, not show bands so much, but yeah, kind of tribute bands, covers bands, that kind of thing. And since then there's been an explosion in new young bands coming out of Galway. Probably the most successful New Dad, Clockworks, where Turnstiles were massive. They split up now, and there's a new raft of bands coming through as well. So there's that level, Aaron. Then there is a sort of big gap really to other Irish bands who generally do play Galway. Um, like Fontaines haven't been to Galway for a long time, but for example, we had Peter Hook and the Light came through the other day. They're a UK band. I know they're a kind of older band now, but like Villagers always play here. I'm just trying to think of a lot of folk acts would play here, and you don't really get then the big international bands so much because I think it's just a bit out of the way, to be honest.
Yeah. No,
And
I've
also
thought
there's a
that.
there's a venue. Sorry to interrupt there. There's a
No,
venue
absolutely.
issue as well. So like we don't have in Galway a sort of 1,500 to 3,000 cap venue. So
Yeah.
there's the Black Box, there's Sea Point, they're kind of around about probably 600 maybe. There's Leisureland, which is about 1,000, I think. Maybe the economics are not good for a touring band, maybe like the size of Fontaines, for example, who probably would sell out 3 or 4,000 very easily. Yeah.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I've spoken to Jake from Freehouse before. I really like that kind of like it seems to me it's sort of filling a void that I think is kind of like needed where again you have kind of like these up and coming artists, and this is why I was interested in talking to you as well, was you have these kind of like up and coming artists who are sort of, everyone's doing the kind of DIY self-releasing route now because it's available, but it can be a very difficult thing, I think, to actually I think people are kind of atomized in that sense because, as you mentioned, I don't think there is that sense of like all the artists are on like one label, and you know, there you know, you like, there are labels that you can trust, and that you're always kind of like listen to whatever they put out. So a lot of things can kind of, I think, just kind of disappear in the ether. Was that kind of like a necessity when kind of forming things like Freehouse or Blowtorch, to try and like get a semblance of a bunch of interesting artists under one umbrella that people could kind of discover?
That isn't how I set out really with Blowtorch, but I think that the point you make is a very good one, Aaron. Yeah, I think we started off by talking about music that I liked back in the day, and what got me into music. And I've said this before on other interviews and podcasts. I not only liked the music for itself, for the what it does to you, the emotion of the music. I was also really interested in what lay behind that. So, like, I was really interested in record labels, for example,
Yeah,
and how music got made and the process of it. And certainly in the UK, we had some brilliant record labels like Domino, Mute, Rough Trade, Factory, and you knew what you were getting from a label. So, for example, Warp, was a big dance music label. Domino indie, Rough Trade, Factory, the indiest of the lot, probably.
yeah,
um, they would be a blueprint really for Blowtorch Records in many ways, from our numbering system down to the fact that we rarely make any money. So uh, what has happened over the years for sure is that I think when people tell me this, and I certainly hope it's the case, that people can trust releases from Blowtorch Records, and they might just take a punt on something that we release even without hearing it, maybe because they kind of think,
yeah,
oh, well, everything else they've done is pretty good, so I'll give it a go. And so that's definitely where we're at the moment. And, I do cultivate that, and we get a lot of contacts from Irish artists. We do promote ourselves as an Irish label, and many of them are just, I don't, I say unsuitable. That's the wrong word. I'm not being pejorative. They're not unsuitable in themselves. It's just the unsuitable music for the type of stuff that we put out.
mhm,
So it very clearly says on our website, and I think if you listen to anything that we do, punk, post-punk, electronica, psych, and shoegaze, those are our kind of genres. We don't do acoustic singer-songwriters.
yeah,
And there's a good reason for that, because if we did, it wouldn't work for them as well as for us, because our audience are not interested in acoustic singer-songwriters. So if I'm
yeah,
trying to promote that person, it's not going to work, and that's not fair on them. I'm
yeah,
just wasting their time, and it's also wasting our time. So, I'm not being nasty and I'm never nasty to people. I always say, look, I'm sorry, but you're not right for us. And I always try and reply. But, there is a reason why record labels pick genres. If a dance label suddenly put out, a death metal album, it would be like, what the fuck? You know, just, and, nobody'd be interested, because people tend to follow, people follow Blowtorch Records because of the type of stuff that we put out.
yeah,
And then in terms of the self-releasing thing, absolutely. I mean, this is, I'm absolutely passionate about this, Aaron. So many people, so many bands are self-releasing brilliant music, and sometimes they just put it out there on streaming platforms. They might do a bit of social media promotion, and it just sinks without a trace. And you listen to these bands some of the times, and they have brilliant music, and they've got 20 listens a month on Spotify or Apple Music or whatever. And it kills me, and I can't promote every song ever that in our genres. But what I do, I try and work with the bands that we have and make sure that at least what they're putting out goes to as many people as possible. And then also we try and do a physical release for nearly everything, whether it's a CD, cassette, or a vinyl record. And again, as I say ad nauseum, I'm sure people are sick of me going on about this, but in 10, 15, 20 years' time, Spotify probably won't exist. There'll be some other medium, but vinyl will still be going. And
Yeah.
I was playing, what was I playing on Sunday? I said this to my wife only on Sunday, actually. I was playing the first Massive Attack album, which was released in 1991. So that album is now 33 years old. And I was playing it on a turntable that is also about, similar vintage. In 33 years' time, I could probably still do that if I was alive, but I probably wouldn't be able to do it on Spotify.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I think like people are so kind of like wrapped in the present that, again, like they don't think of future proofing their music as much because, like, again, you go to something like say DistroKid and you upload your music and you think that's kind of done. But again, I think that you're right in the sense that preservation of music is such a significant thing. Even like I remember when kind of like just like kind of before like Spotify became like a big um avenue for artists to kind
Mm.
of self-release stuff, people even just like swapping demo CDs, and like I still have a bunch of those like from just like random artists that I would see like around the city and stuff, and people who would just give you like demos. And even something like that, even just burning it onto like a CD or can like really preserve that in time, in a way that if Spotify shut down their servers randomly, I think like now we're seeing, say, like with Twitter, for example, like just how like a random CEO can totally
Mm.
turn up the platform that we all use. And do you think that the kind of ephemerality of these kind of like tech platforms that we all rely on um could potentially be a bad thing for artists in the sense that they have no real stake? I mean, obviously, you can look at something like Spotify in terms of like its compensation of artists, but just in general, like we're all kind of, I think, beholden to a bunch of companies that we, don't really have, that don't have our interests at heart, and that we have no real stake in.
Um, totally. Yeah,
Yeah.
like I feel like, don't get me started, Aaron.
No, please get
I mean,
started.
look at like what's happening in the US now with books, for example. I mean, they're banning books or removing books from library shelves that have any mention of diversity. Um, Trigger words, essentially, trigger words for the government, or for Trump. And uh, I'm sure Elon Musk is sending his, 20-year-old interns into these places,
Yeah.
and they're looking for things that have pretty innocuous words like woman in.
Mhm.
And you think, okay, at the moment, we think Spotify is an open platform. It may or may not be because we don't know what their algorithm really is. But supposing whatever he's called, Daniel Elk, is it, decided in 2 years' time that he's going down the kind of Great Reset route or the ultra right wing route, or he becomes a born again Christian, whatever it is.
Mhm.
Who's to say that he won't start banning stuff on the platform that promotes views that are against his? Now, I know that would be against his profit principles, but who's to say? It might happen. And then this platform that we've all, well, not all, but most of us have something to do with, whether it's just playing a playlist or trying to upload songs to it, is just gone as a useful platform. Yeah, what do we do then? And something else will come along, I'm sure. However, and I don't mean to be smug, but most of the bands that we release will have something that they can promote. Whether it's vinyl, CD, or cassette, as I say.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think that's a great thing. I take a lot of comfort in that and a lot of pride, really. I think that taking the effort to put out a physical release and do the extra things that are required for it, like getting nice artwork done that suits it, and printing it out and making sure it's all done correctly, and giving the value adds. Like the last release we did was a 10-inch vinyl for Blue Slate from
Hmm.
Nace in Kildare, and it was when I put it together, it was such a lovely artifact, Aaron. It was 10-inch on black or white vinyl, um, back and front artwork. There was a photograph of the band as an insert, and then on the front we had a hype sticker on the front, and each one was hand numbered. And you look at that and you think, if anybody who would look at that, think, a lot of care and attention has gone into that.
Yeah.
It wasn't just a digital upload to, as you say, DistroKid or CD Baby. And I know it's not for everybody, and that's fine. But that's what we do. That's our thing. Yeah. So yeah, digital is important. Absolutely. We would consider the physical release. Well, I was going to say as important. For us, it's probably more important. Yeah.
Before we talk about Blowtorch, I want to ask a little bit about your background in terms of like getting involved, I guess, in the music industry side of things. So did you have much background in terms of um prior to Blowtorch, what was your kind of like background in terms of like the music industry? You were kind of mentioning some of the record labels that inspired you. I was thinking of some of the figures that we often think about like Tony Wilson or Jeff Travis and people like this. So, did any of those kind of like figures kind of inspire you? Did you read any of the kind of stuff that they had written? Like what was your in, I guess, to the kind of the music industry?
I had no music industry background at all, Aaron, apart from being a fan, a music fan. And as I say, I did have a interest stroke obsession with certain figures. Yeah, I mean, Tony Wilson, yeah, definitely huge for me. I've read loads of books about Factory Records and the whole way they operated, the bands. I suppose like some of my favorite bands ever were on Factory Records as well, particularly New Order. Some of them nearly signed, like the Smiths. So it's
Yeah.
almost as, it's almost as much about the ones that got away as the ones that were on there. But I have a great interest in politics as well. I'm unashamedly left wing, and I think the way that they ran it kind of chimed with my politics as well. So I have a bit of a downer on the major labels because I think they wreck, they have wrecked many people's careers, and they've skewed the way that music is released. And sort of 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when did Spotify kind of really get going? Probably about 15 years ago, wasn't it?
Hmm.
It seemed like a new dawn, this era where people could record their own music. And I think I called it in another interview or podcast, the democratization, digital democratization. So, you could record it to a good standard, you could upload it yourself onto a platform, and people could listen to it for free, essentially. And that all seemed amazing because there was no gatekeepers. The major labels weren't acting as the tastemakers, where an A&R person said, we think that's good enough, we're going to produce it, or we don't think that's good enough, go away. And that was the death knell for many bands. So, this digital democratization seemed like a good idea until, of course, Spotify became the behemoth that it is now, and they're kind of acting as gatekeepers, not by stopping people uploading, but by the way their algorithm works, but also in terms of what they pay to people. I
Yeah.
mean, that's a kind of gatekeeping. But then, of course, when it seemed like the major labels' influence was waning because of the new streaming platforms. In fact, they're kind of back bigger than ever now because they're buying up back catalogs. They're buying up whoever. I mean, Bob Dylan, Neil Young, Bruce Springsteen. They've bought up their back catalogs, so they're much more interested in promoting older music rather than new music, and they still, they're able to strike deals with the streaming platforms, preferential deals. So again, artists that are with them get a better deal. So we're kind of back to square one in a way, except it's almost worse because most artists aren't getting paid anything at all. I mean, the new rule, was it if you're less than 1,000 streams a year on Spotify, you don't get anything at all. So
Yeah.
yeah, once again, what appeared to be a bright new dawn has curdled somewhat. The dream has gone sour. And that's what I loved about the likes of Factory Records, for example, Rough Trade. Yeah, I mean, they did do, oh, well, Rough Trade still are, I think, doing great stuff. They kicking against the pricks, they mean, I don't know whether they're financially solid or not, but they're still there. They're still doing good stuff as far as I'm concerned. And it might not be to everybody's taste, but they are something very different in an increasingly corporate world. And look, Blowtorch Records is tiny. I mean, it's basically me in a small office in our house and a bit of help from some others and whatever we have, 10 bands, 12 bands. And yeah, it's run on goodwill, a prayer, the odd very good release, and that's what keeps us going. And people like you taking an interest. I'll be perfectly honest about that, Aaron. When people say, we really like what you do, we want to talk to you, it gives you a fillip. It kind of think, well, it's worth carrying on.
No, absolutely, and like yeah, as I was mentioning when I reached out to this interview, I was like really I interviewed like a couple of artists who like who's on your who've released stuff through you, and I was just like really inspired by again it was a similar thing I think of like like the Sif Records thing I think of like all these kind of like labels that uh again we're kind of like incorporating that sound and that kind of trust and people kind of like
Mm,
trusted the actual label because I was growing up, I was like into the kind of the 80s punk music and the punk scene
okay.
and just kind of like all those kind of like
Mm,
small indie labels that came out like Discord and Alternative Tentacles and stuff like that. And I was like really inspired by that. And then of course obviously as you mentioned like places like Rough Trade and Factory. And I don't know, I thought it was like really cool that we had something like that here that was actually kind of like giving artists like an opportunity, like a truly indie label, which in a kind of an era in which yeah everyone's kind of going the DIY route. I was wondering if was Blowtorch because you kind of mentioned there that you had no kind of like prior history like in the music industry. Was it kind of like a matter of learning as you went?
oh, very much. Yeah. It was, I mean, I had some background in web design, doing, working with websites, the digital side of things. So so I came up with the name, I came up with the logo and set up the website. And then it was a case of, right, what do we do now? What happens now kind of thing. And you start promoting, stuff on social media, posting on Twitter as it was then, and Instagram, and then it was mainly. I mean, I initially just started looking for bands on SoundCloud to work with. It was a hobby to start off with, and that was in 2019, and here we are in 2025, and it's something very different. So yeah, it's something that I've almost fallen into accidentally, and it has changed a lot. I think 100% of our bands are now Irish, whereas at the start it was probably 10 or 20%. And I didn't really identify as an Irish label initially, and that certainly has become clear over the years that that's a much better way to go. It's like having a genre, having a location, I think is also a useful thing. The Irish scene is vibrant at the moment, particularly for guitar bands, but in many other areas as well. Like I think, rap and hip hop is strong in Ireland, dance music is strong. So there, so there's the benefit in the genre identification, in the geographical identification, and I'm sure in the next 3 years, other things will change as well. It, it's hard to be proactive in in this because you don't know what's coming, and I can control certain things like what physical stuff we put out and working with record plants and the like. Who knows what the tech bros are going to do in the next 3 years, Aaron, and that's what drives me crazy. But that's why I also don't really want to be reliant on them.
Yeah.
Like, I wouldn't really care if Spotify finished tomorrow. It wouldn't really make any difference to me. I would listen to my vinyl collection. I would find another way to promote the bands. I still have a lot of copies of physical releases of old releases from bands on the label. I could still sell those. There will still be record shops. And I'd say somewhere on hard drives, I have loads of thousands and thousands of songs downloaded. Like you said, you had CDRs that you'd burnt. I could probably find stuff tucked away. I've got an old iPod somewhere. It's got
Yeah.
about 3,000 songs on. I could fire that up again. In fact, I have a Walkman actually. I could fire up my Walkman again and, play my cassettes on it. So yeah, um, honestly, it wouldn't bother me if the streaming platforms finished tomorrow. I mean, it'd be a bit of a pain that you couldn't find the song you wanted instantly, maybe, but
Mhm.
you get over it, I'd say.
Well, one thing I've talked about a bunch was a couple of years ago. I think they've reversed this decision, but at the time, a couple of artists, Neil Young, Johnny Mitchell, and Steve Albini are the three that
Mm.
come to my mind. Decided to kind of due to unfair treatment of artists on Spotify, as well as I believe they were also annoyed at Spotify kind of pivoting more towards podcasting, considering that it was really
Well, the Joe Rogan thing, wasn't it? I think
it was
with
specifically Joe
Neil
Rogan
Young,
as
yeah,
well. Yeah,
yeah.
with Neil Young,
Mm.
I think Rogan had made some anti-vaccine
Mm.
comments or something like that. I'm not too familiar with with Rogan's output. Um,
No, me neither, fortunately. Yeah.
but do you think that's kind of a sign? You were talking about kind of sort of major labels system. Do you think that's a sign that well, Steve Albini wasn't on a major, but for Johnny Mitchell and Neil Young, that artists could still have some semblance of autonomy, or do you think that's more a case of artists like Johnny Mitchell and Neil Young having enough kind of cachet and capital really to be able to make a decision like that? Do you think if it was a younger artist, less established artist, or that they would be able to kind of make that decision? And also, just to add on to that, I'm just trying to prune your opinions on the major label system in the modern day. One thing I always noticed was that recently a lot of artists now aren't necessarily signing with major labels, they're more so licensing, which is after a certain amount of years they'll retain the rights to that music they've made. I don't think that's altruism on the major label systems part. I think that's more a sign actually of their waning control. I think ever since like the Napster days, they've just been kind of struggling to really regain that control that they had in the 20th century. Yeah, I was wondering, and also sorry, just add on to all this. I'll just put parts all on in one comment. Recently, Chappell Roan at the Grammys made a statement that major labels, for example, aren't giving health benefits to their artists. They're saying, well, we're propping you up. Do you have our back? In a lot of ways, do you think artists have any semblance of more autonomy now in the major label system, or do you think it's as bad as it's always been?
Oh, I think it's definitely as bad as it's always been. Uh, Just to go through the points, I mean, I love Neil Young. I have great respect for Neil Young and for Joni Mitchell. I think there's an element of virtue signaling going on there because, plainly they multi-millionaires. It makes no difference to them whether their music's on Spotify or not, And then, I think Neil Young has sold his back catalogue to Sony, hasn't he? I think so.
Yeah.
I mean, whatever he got, 200 million for that. Look, fair play to him, he's earned it, I suppose. But that feeds into your second point, I think, about the influence of major labels. I think they know that their influence and possibly their way of making profits from new bands is waning, so they will plunder the back catalogues of artists that they can, pay for their huge back catalogues, and they will sell them for sync rights, to be used in TVs and movies. They will just endlessly repackage them in more and more vinyl that people have already got, and they're essentially ripping off or scalping fans because they think, oh yeah, I must have that smoky purple double vinyl 180-gram release,
Yeah.
and they've already got it. They don't need it again. They're reselling stuff to a shrinking audience, and I don't know what's going to happen in 50 years' time because I suppose, people still buy a lot of stuff by the Beatles and the Rolling Stones now. I don't know, will people be buying stuff still from Neil Young or Madonna, sort of, or I don't know, Kylie Minogue in 50 years' time? I mean, if if the new artists haven't been developed, what's the music scene going to look like? But they have no interest in longevity in the long term. They're all interested in his profits for shareholders now, and that model is their previous model. Yeah, definitely is dead. And there's been some really interesting posts by James Blake on Instagram recently about exactly that. And he said he compared the old major label model where they paid you in advance, but out of that advance, that advance paid for the making of the album and a tour, but essentially you had to pay that advance back. It wasn't money for you; it was a loan.
Yeah.
But they also, usually owned the master recordings, kept 50% of the copyright, if not 100% of the copyright. So your scope for making money out of your own music, down the line was very, very much reduced. And he compared it to a package holiday, where everybody gets on a plane, goes to the same hotel, they eat the same food at the same time in the same restaurant, go through in the same swimming pool. And that just does not fit these days, because there's such a diverse range of acts, and the he looked at various platforms and he came up with one. He said he didn't just want to come. I mean, James Blake is reasonably successful, and he said, "Look, I don't just want to come across as a moaner. I've actually done some research into this, and I think he found a platform called Indify. You'd have to check that. It's on his post on Instagram anyway, and it's like a company, and you go through a questionnaire, and they come up with the kind of best route for your physical releases or your career progress, and it might be, make 50 cassettes, or it might be press 3,000 vinyl, I mean, plainly it's going to be different for him than it is for Chapel Rowan, for example, as you mentioned. And, she makes a very good point. I absolutely, and I loved her speech at wherever it was recently, the Emmys or whatever it was. You know, I think to have the chutzpah to stand up in front of industry executives and say your industry is broken,
Yeah.
fair play to her, I admire her. And she, I think, would be exactly the kind of artist would be that major labels would be all over while it suited them. And then as soon as, I don't know, her audience moved on, or she said something that they didn't agree with, or suddenly in, well, Trump's America, for example, you could imagine that somebody who identified as non-binary could almost be cancelled overnight.
Yeah.
Then they'd be like, oh, well, it doesn't matter because we've got another Chapel Rowan down the line, or we've got another, interesting left field artist that we can promote, but while still keeping within Elon Musk's guidelines, that kind of thing. Like,
Yeah.
like,
It's the new voice police, Elon
yeah,
Musk.
exactly, yeah. Like, I couldn't give a fuck, I'm not dependent on Elon Musk. I'm not dependent on uh, Mark Zuckerberg.
Hmm.
Yeah, I use Facebook all the time, but sorry, not Facebook. I use Instagram all the time. Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't know if Facebook's a dead loss. I use Instagram all the time. Yeah, absolutely. But if it disappeared overnight, I wouldn't be that bothered. I'll find
Yeah.
another way. I'll send out a letter. I can send, I have an independent newsletter that goes out to 1,000 people every
Yeah.
week. I'll go that route. I don't care. I really don't, on Aaron, and I'm not being flippant. I am not, I'm not dependent on them, but I absolutely take pride in not being dependent on them. And yeah, I can be very stubborn like that. But I'm not a multinational, and um, I that's the beauty of being an independent, a micro independent in our case. I don't owe any money to the banks. I don't have massive deals with anybody. It's just a nice little cottage industry. We work well with the bands. I like them. They like us. We put out what we want when we want to an audience who appreciate it, and it works very well as far as I'm concerned. Yeah. So I suppose if you wanted a neat summation of Blowtorch Records, that's where it is. But you know what you're getting. We published a manifesto a few years ago, and it very clearly states who we are and what we do and what to expect. And it's not about profit. It's about art. It's about people who are interested in art, about people who chime with my kind of views. It very clearly says, we will not tolerate any kind of hate speech, divisiveness, fascists can fuck off, etc., etc. You know where we're coming from.
Yeah.
So that makes it very easy for me to say to people, no, it doesn't chime with our views, and I am completely unapologetic about that. I'm becoming less so because somebody has to stand up to the bullies, and obviously, the tech bros are not going to take any notice of us.
Yeah.
But in my world viewpoint, I'm doing my bit. What
Yeah.
else can you do? Seriously, like you can only live your own life to a certain level of acceptability and standards. I mean, and try and bring that into your interactions with other people. There's nothing else you can do, is there?
No, and yeah, again, I can see the Tony Wilson
Hmm.
influence there in that regard. Um, you've been very great. I don't want to take up too much more of your time. I just wanted to actually ask a little bit about the kind of material reality of what you're doing with Blowtorch. So, I've spoken with other artists who've want to release vinyl records, and obviously it's a very expensive endeavor. And even if you do have the money to do so, it's the kind of manufacturing, the actual the pressing plants
Mm.
are very backed up for like months at a time. And in fact, I've spoken to other artists before, and I'm like, when's your album out? And they're like, well, we're waiting for the vinyl release, so that kind of actually determines the release date of the
Mm.
record in a lot of ways. Like I spoke one time for a different publication to the Melvins, and they were like, oh yeah, our albums came early, so it's out now, and it's just kind of like that. I was wondering, like, just in terms of, because you were mentioning kind of like learning as you went. I was wondering, how do you kind of ensure that, first of all, that well, obviously you do pre-orders, so people pre-order the record, and that kind of like gives somewhat of a guarantee before you even press, I assume.
Mm.
But just in terms of is making sure that the vinyls that you're ordering are actually out in time, that there's a good release day. in terms of like scheduling, in terms of making sure that the record is finished and all these different factors, how do you kind of ensure a consistent flow in terms of getting people's records out?
Yeah, the backlog is not as long as it was a couple of years ago, Aaron. So then sort of around about COVID time, you were looking at 6 to 9 months maybe
Yeah.
to get a vinyl record pressed. Now it's down to somewhere between 10 to 12 weeks.
Okay.
So that's a much more acceptable time to wait. It's fairly, yeah, you can pretty much depend on that actually. So that does. So in that case, it's a case of working with the band. They say just letting them know that we have a, probably a 4 month lag. So if you're thinking of releasing something that you want to press to vinyl, we need at least 4 months notice, and then try and coincide the digital and the vinyl release. You're right, we do pre-orders. I mean, generally with vinyl, you're paying at least half of it, if not all of it, up front, which
Mhm.
is obviously quite a big outlay. And the pre-orders, if anybody ever wonders why we do pre-orders, that's why. I mean, it helps us massively because we're getting income back against the deposit that we have paid, to get the vinyl made. But it also helps to gauge numbers as well. And there is some leeway to change the number that you get made. So if you, I don't know, ordered 500 and you did a pre-order and only two people bought it on the pre-order, you might want to revise that down. And that works the other way, vice versa. We have upped the number of records that we've ordered because the pre-order has been so strong. So that there are good reasons for doing that. We're not just trying to get money off people for no reason. And yeah, as I say, I think if you can coincide the vinyl and the digital release, it does help. There is probably greater supply than demand in the vinyl pressing industry at the moment. So I get loads of emails from plants all over well, Europe in particular, offering deals, offering really good time frames, and we never got those 4 years ago.
Yeah.
So I think people are, vinyl pressing plants are looking for business for sure, which is an interesting development. And then in terms of vinyl in general, I know that we keep seeing newspaper articles, particularly in the broadsheets, about the revival of vinyl and how strong the sales are. Yeah, I take that with a pinch of salt, to be honest. You never sell as many as you think you're gonna sell.
No,
So if anybody's thinking of pressing vinyl, always revise downwards is my advice.
well, actually, was that because you mentioned there the backlog during COVID, and obviously because like workers were had to quarantine, but that's kind of like in the time frame that Blowtorch actually started. So was that kind of like a difficult time then in terms of actually kind of beginning this operation just as this pandemic kind of hit the world?
Yeah, I'm trying to think back, Arian. And look, one thing, I think that's one thing that somebody like me or a decent record label can do is, provide organization, I suppose. And I think even Factory Records managed to do that. Tony Wilson maybe not so much, but they had, like Alan Erasmus in the background. He was the guy who kind of ran the admin side of it, whereas Tony Wilson was the mouthy figurehead. And you do need to be organized, and that's partly, you know, keeping costs under control, I suppose, but also being fair to artists, and I said this right from the start, bands or artists should be spending their any time and energy on making brilliant music. They don't really, or they shouldn't have to, I don't think, then spend 3 hours a night, looking at spreadsheets or trying to liaise with people or do stuff that they're not so good at, which might be, organizing all the assets that are required for a release, or getting them there on time, or sorting the money out. That is what we're quite good at.
Yeah.
And I, yeah, sometimes have to pester bands, say, oh, I really need the artwork now, or I really need those mastered WAVs. But it's me doing it in a reasonable way. It's not the plant sending threatening emails, or even worse, I suppose, not sending any emails at all and then
Mm.
missing deadlines. I'm across that stuff for bands. That's part of what we do. And uh, I'm trying to think. Yeah, we did have some pretty long backlogs, and I can remember dealing with plants and saying, "Come on, we really need this. You said it was going to be here 3 weeks ago." And I suppose that's the benefit of being maybe an older person from who's emailing from a record label account, rather than somebody, just one person in a band going, "Please, can we have our vinyl?" And
Yeah.
they just get shoved down the queue. I mean, I did, yeah, I'm not saying throwing my weight around, but just be firm and reasonable. And, we got there in the end. But yeah, there were some long delays. Yeah, I'm thinking about it now. But like, this is heaven where we are now. I mean, like the Pebble Dash vinyl, which is the next one that's coming out in a couple of weeks. Like, I think we only ordered that, I can't remember, it was around Christmas time, I think. And here we are, saying we're going to be delivering it in the first or second week of March.
Yeah.
And that's unheard of in recent history.
Yeah. No, I'm like just interested in myself, just as a kind of I don't know, in a nerdy way. I'm just interested in kind of the machinations of the industry, I guess. Uh,
Yeah, I mean, look, there's a very strong process. Obviously the plants have a process. You provide the vinyl, sorry, the audio, you provide the artwork. They make the labels, they make the covers, they create what's called a stamper,
mhm.
and that takes about 5 weeks usually. They make test pressings, they send them to you. You listen to the test pressings, you give the okay, or otherwise. I think we've only ever had one test pressing that we didn't okay, and that's because it was pressed at the wrong speed.
Okay.
Um, and then once you give the go ahead, they go and make the full run of vinyl. And to make each, if you're doing a run of 200, they do them all at the same time. And it takes about 30 seconds to make one vinyl record.
Oh,
Once
really?
once they've got the test, once they've got the stamper, because it's
Yeah.
literally just, it's like a stamper's actually a positive, if you like. The grooves stick out the way, rather than, and then when you press them into the molten PVC, that makes the grooves,
Mhm.
and they stamp it, and it takes about 30 seconds, and it just goes on like that. So to make 200 vinyl records, they could probably do it in a morning.
Yeah. That's cool.
Yeah, but it's just getting to the point where they have all the bits that are required, and then they have a space in their schedule.
Perfect.
And that was the other thing that was, just to go back to the thing we were talking about, the major labels. That was what was so annoying in COVID times, was they were looking to make money because they knew that people were at home. They were looking to spend stuff online, spend money online, and they would buy, I'm not saying they would buy anything, but people were much more open to buying stuff because there was nothing else to do.
Yeah.
And they were buying endless reissues. And so, the main reason really why the backlog was so great, why the delay was so long, was because the major labels were printing hundreds of thousands of old Fleetwood Mac albums, and Neil Young albums, and Rolling Stones
Yeah.
albums, and Elton John albums. And you're like, what the fuck? Does the world need any more Fleetwood Mac reissues? And then they're on sale from Golden Discs, for 50 quid each. Like,
Yeah.
fuck off. I know how much it costs to make a vinyl record. And all that money, any upfront costs have been paid off years, if not decades ago.
Yeah.
It's just pure profit.
Right.
And it is interesting if anybody who has more than a passive interest in this, just go into the economics of it. They if say I don't know whoever what record label Fleetwood Mac are on, I don't care, but say they're on Universal,
Hmm.
they will have a deal, a publishing deal, and Universal might get 50%, and Fleetwood Mac and whoever the songwriters are get 50%. So once Universal have paid for the pressing of another 100,000 Fleetwood Mac albums, essentially they get 50% of the profits because that's what the publishing deal is. I
Yeah.
mean, it's just money for old rope. It really is. And then they whine on about, how things are so bad and, the state of the music industry. But, that just goes into shareholders' pockets. It's not going into developing any young artists. I mean, they don't really have, I mean, at least back in sort of, I don't know, 80s, 90s, major record labels made some semblance, some pretense of being interested in new music because they had so-called indie imprints, and they weren't actually truly independent, but they were, an offshoot of a major label who signed, bands like, I don't know, Teardrop Explodes, those kind of, uh, James, In Spiral Carpets, a kind of second. Yeah, again, I don't want to be pejorative, but not massive indie bands, but kind of, the
Yeah.
next rung down, shall we say? Um,
Yeah.
and
In the first hour of Top of the Pops.
yeah, 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 the bands that you see on, BBC Four documentaries now, yeah, yeah, and yeah, they were making some effort to develop new talent, and they don't even do that anymore.
Yeah. No, yeah, that's true. I was talking to a different artist and they were kind of saying like, yeah, the days of kind of like A&R is really dead. Like, because there used to be that kind of like romantic idea, I think, of like you play a club gig and then some A&R guy will give you his card and then,
Mm.
all of a sudden you're on like Virgin Records.
Yeah, I'd say that happened to very few bands,
Yeah.
but yeah, I mean that's the way it worked, yeah, and all the your any profits you made from that was made from the music, went to mainly paying off the advance, the A&R person's coke habit, and staying in five-star hotels at industry junkets. Yeah, it was a broken model. It was, it
It was
worked
a
for
bubble.
very few people, and you still hear how many stories do you still hear to this day of bands who don't own their own recordings? Big bands,
Yeah.
Well, Taylor Swift didn't own her own recordings, for fuck's sake, until she
Yeah.
re-recorded them. I
Yeah.
mean,
No,
it's past
yeah,
belief.
yeah, and it's crazy because like the more cachet your band gets and the more popular it gets, the more when you eventually do try to buy your own catalog, the more money that will accrue because then it's going to be even more expensive. And especially like now, because like if you were making, say, music back in like the 80s and 90s when people were actually buying records and it was it's a really sustainable thing. And
Mm.
now where a lot of people are just streaming stuff and the residuals on that are crap, it's going to get like much more harder to. I think it's going to get much more difficult to actually buy that back then in the long run. Again, it just seems like kind of like not really future proofing in a lot of ways, you know?
Yeah, I totally agree, and I admire the ambition and the resilience of any band that really tries to make it because it's going to be fucking hard work. It's
Yeah.
going to be tour, tour, tour. I mean, look at Fontaine's. I mean, I've seen some stuff online. People getting a little bit sort of sniffy about the amount of merch that they're putting out and the kind of rebrands that they had recently. With their new style and everything. And yeah, in a way, maybe it's a little bit disappointing, but they wouldn't sell huge amounts of physical copies. We think because I don't know about you, Aaron, I can't talk for you, but
Sure.
I think like Fontaines are massive because they're kind of big in my world, but they're not big in the world.
Right.
I'd say if you ask people in O'Connell Street, what do you think of Fontaines? There's probably 50% of them be like, I've never heard of them. So, I think fair enough that they try and, they have to earn a living. You can't
Yeah,
expect them to just keep out putting out brilliant music but have no money. That's not fair.
yeah.
So they have to get the money from somewhere, and they probably don't get that much from the vinyl sales. So they do need to sell merch and they need to tour. And
Mhm.
endless touring is really hard. I'd say very bad for your mental health, and also not really conducive to producing brilliant new music. Because to do that, I think you need time, space, the ability to sit down and think and not be forever on the road.
Yeah, and that's one thing I noticed too, actually, when you're talking about like actually artists making revenue, is that a lot of venues now are doing merch cuts, which are kind of forcing bands to have to hike up the price of their merch. And something I'm noticing lately with a lot of like kind of smaller bands is that they're doing pop-ups before the show or after the show,
Mm,
so that way any merch you buy will go directly to them and the venue doesn't take a cut. And especially like you were mentioning Fontaines, like I can imagine like the kind of venues they're playing, they're probably all like, they're contracted to have people selling their merch rather than having their own people selling it, if that makes sense. So I think that's just going to hit them and the consumer in a lot of ways too.
yeah, I don't know how it works at bigger venues. I think that taking a cut of the merch is abhorrent. I think it's one of the dodgiest business practices I've ever heard of. And I know venues have to make money, and a lot of venues are struggling.
Yeah.
However, taking income from an artist where actually that might be their only income almost is self-defeating, because soon they will have no bands to put on in their venue. So then they definitely won't be able to make any money because there won't be anybody to tour.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's an ecosystem. It's the same as any ecosystem, whether it's the natural world or the music industry. You know, all the bits of it have to work together. They all have to be healthy. So there has to be the new stuff, the new shoots coming through. Um, there has to be the mature stuff. There has to be literally grassroots in both cases, well, in nature's case and in the industry's case. There has to be things to nurture it. I mean, like, I've just thought of this now, but it is actually quite a good analogy. You know, any, and the natural ecosystem or the music ecosystem needs all parts of it to be healthy and functioning to keep it all going, to keep, to have an healthy ongoing system.
I
And
absolutely
as soon as
agree.
somebody jumps in and disrupts that, yeah, you're kind of fucked, really.
Yeah, I think the next we're kind of talking about the major labels kind of bubble bursting. I think the next one, in my personal opinion, is um the ticketing systems, as well as the just kind of like the general management in that regard for like the major labels and for
Mm,
the major artists and the major big tent concerts. I think like now it's actually going to get to a regulatory standpoint, which obviously no industry wants government regulation. They want to all self-regulate, but I think they've played their hand in that, and they're like, I think that's going to be coming next. And I think I always encourage people, if there's having sometimes gigs will be simultaneously, tickets will be available through Ticketmaster, or they'll be available through like Tickets.ie or Eventbrite
mm.
or Gigantic or one of these. And I always just say, go for the other one. Just like, give them some money instead because they don't try and rip you off as much. But
Yeah, I would agree, Aaron, absolutely. And it is right for regulation, really, but that's their own fault. And
absolutely.
also, when I was talking about the ecosystem there, audience, the audience members are a part of that ecosystem, and they do have a part to play. And I'm not in the business of telling anybody what to do, but I would urge anybody who has an interest in music and live music, to try and help out as well. You can do your part. So, for example, you can buy through try and buy through a more reputable um, agency. Um, don't spuriously ask to get put on the guest list at a tiny gig, because
Mhm.
most of the ticket money is actually required to pay costs and the band. Um, For example, we're doing a showcase, Blowtorch showcase in the Roisin Dove in Galway on May the 1st. Shameless plug. We're
No,
selling
please plug
early,
away.
yeah, we are selling early bird tickets for €10 for 8 bands and a DJ. Please help us. Buy those tickets. It helps us plan. It's going to be more money for the bands. It helps us pay off our costs. If if you have, and I know there's a cost of living crisis, but if you have €10 to spare, but not 20, then, maybe buy a CD. One CD is worth, something like 30,000 streams. It
Mm,
makes a huge, huge difference. And what's that? It's not even 2 pints, the price of a CD.
yeah,
And so, yeah, as I say, not trying to tell anybody what to do, but we all have a part to play. And the audience, whether it's a streaming audience, or a listening audience or a live music audience, can do their bit as well. And also, one of the things that's good about social media is you can contact bands, not just follow them. A lot of bands will be happily to get an email or a DM maybe from you,
yeah,
just saying how much you like them, or do you have anything, if it says on Bandcamp that the CD is sold out, do you have any tucked away that I could buy from you direct? I'll send you the money on PayPal. Let's do more. Social media is meant to connect us. I think at the moment, the way social media is going, it's disconnecting us because it's just full of fucking influencers who, like, as soon as I see an influencer, I just skip by.
yeah,
Worse for a lot of people is they see an influencer and think my life could be never like that, and it adversely affects their mental health. The brilliant thing about music, I think, is that it can actually connect people and bands and me. I'm always delighted to hear from people. Seriously, you know, and they might have a spare CD tucked away in in their office somewhere, or a freebie, or they might be delighted to do an interview or a podcast. You know, they might be a bit shy and thinking, I'm not going to be putting myself out there to do this stuff. And then somebody says, oh, we'll be interested in doing a chat like you're doing with me, Aaron.
mm,
And it might be the one that somebody sees and then passes on to somebody else. And in 6 months' time, I don't know, they're getting offered one of their songs to be on a Netflix movie or a BBC series. It does happen,
yeah,
but it doesn't happen. Like, who was it? Gary Player, the golf fella, the South African, he was a brilliant golfer, but he said, the more I practice, the luckier I get.
yeah,
And it's the same principle. If you just open yourself up, make connections, you're maximizing the chances of something happening. And I think that's the one good thing about social media for musicians, is that you can converse, be in contact direct with fans. And look, if you don't want to, you can close off your DMs, you can go private, whatever you want to do. There's lots of ways of not doing that, but if you're open to it, then that opportunity is there. And the same for fans as well. Not in a stalkerish kind of way, obviously, or inappropriate, but yeah. So
perfect.
yeah, another rant.
I'll ask one final thing, and then I'll let you get on with your day. And thanks very much for giving me your time. Very
You're
gracious.
welcome.
I was just going to ask actually about the kind of expansion of Blowtorch because, beyond just a record label, as you're mentioning, you do podcasting, you do articles on the website, as well as like featuring other writers. And,
Mm.
it seems like even if an artist isn't like releasing their music through Blowtorch, you're still willing to kind of give them some press and some exposure. Um, obviously you were mentioning there you're doing showcases. And I think that's all like I think that's all part of why a label should kind of exist is kind of fostering almost kind of a familiar thing where all the artists are kind of like people kind of are coming to the label because as you mentioned they trust your decisions, they trust who you're putting out and stuff like that, and then like actually kind of building the mall where it's like, well, if you come to this building, you can see them all in one night and things like that. I was wondering
Hmm.
about the expansion of Blowtorch Records. I mean, what do you actually see for beyond just distribution?
Just a community of like-minded people, really, Aaron. I think once you accept that money is not the primary objective, the
Hmm.
primary goal, then life becomes much easier, to be honest, because you are not you're not dependent on having to sell stuff. And I have a job as well, that's where I get my income from mainly. And I do blowtorch pretty much in my spare time. And I don't think we will expand it massively from where it is now. It's more a case of how do you do it in a more efficient kind of way, I suppose. I know it's a big corporate phrase, work smarter, not work harder. Um, I'd say a lot of corporates don't believe in that really, they want their
Yeah,
employees to work a lot harder. But
of course.
from my point of view, so for example, yeah, you're right. Like we do feature bands who are not on the label quite a lot. One way that we can do that quite easily, we have a new Irish music playlist on Spotify, and I will add pretty much any new Irish artist to that playlist, if they get in touch. And that takes, a couple of minutes of my time. And I'm not saying we have a massive playlist following, but, it all helps.
Yeah, of course.
And, that's something I can do that takes very little of my time, particularly new bands. I think they see, it's a fill up to them. And there are, we have independent writers who write for Blowtorch, so it's not necessarily me who's writing it. So it's not taking up my time. I pay people to write for Blowtorch. I know a lot of people write stuff for blogs for free. We actually pay people who write for us. So in that way, I suppose, people always say to me, how do you find the time? Well, it's not just me doing it all. There are other people involved. Um, and yeah, I just think maybe, I don't know, it sounds uh, a bit wanky, a bit, lofty about, oh, we want to be a like-minded community. But I don't see anything wrong with that. And I don't see any other way in which you can make sense of the world, to be honest, Aaron. I can't. And bands in Galway or Dublin or Ireland in general, how do they make sense of Sony Records headquartered in Los Angeles, or turning over 2 billion a year and not having any interest in us? How do you make sense of South by Southwest, even, when it costs 5 grand to get a visa to go play a show in the States?
Yeah.
These things to a lot of people are just unattainable. They're just pipe dreams. So make your local town a community and try and foster talent and be good to other people, and I think you can make a scene. It reaches a critical mass, and that's kind of what's happened in Galway. There's a good example. Like there's a really good band in Galway called Shark School,
Yeah.
and Nora Staunton is the front woman of Shark School, but she's also the drummer in a band called Puck from
Yeah.
Galway. And I
A lot of
love
cross-pollination in the Irish
that. Look,
music scene.
exactly, the cross-pollination. When you get, I suppose it was, look at, I don't know, say Oxford back in the 90s, there was Ride, there was Radiohead, there was Chapter House,
Mhm.
London, obviously, because it was massive. But, in Leeds in the 80s, there was a real sort of post-punk thing with Delta 5 and Gang of Four, and there was Soft Cell. Liverpool in the 80s, Teardrop Explodes, the Eric's, the Club, Big in Japan. Once you get a critical mass of bands in a certain place, everything can become a little bit easier. And if I can help with that, in Galway, then fantastic, And there's other people doing stuff, like there's a great guy called Jason who runs Big Moon Records in Drogheda. He's got a bit of a scene going on there. There's a band called Spit. One of the guys from Spit works in Big Moon Records, or he did. I don't know if he still does. Once you get that kind of energy going in a place, then things start to happen
Yeah.
organically.
Yeah. Actually, just one final thing I wanted to mention there. You briefly mentioned Eric's in Liverpool. I was over in Liverpool at the end of 2023, December,
Okay.
and I was going to a gig at the Cavern Club. I didn't realize that Eric's was literally right opposite the Cavern Club on
Yeah.
Matthew Street. I was like, oh, well, and I wanted to go in, but I didn't know things closed a little earlier over there than they do here. I was
Yeah.
going in about 10 o'clock, and the guy was like, yeah, we're closing. I was like, okay.
Yeah. Okay. Rock and roll.
Thanks very much for your time, Richard. It was really nice chatting with you. And I just like I say, is there anything you'd like to add before we wrap up? I mean, obviously, there's a showcase on May 1st. We'll put links to the tickets in the
Hmm.
article. But beyond that, is there anything you'd like to
No, I think I have said my piece.
add?
I got everything off my chest. Thank you very much. A bit like a therapy session, is this,
Yeah,
Aaron? Yeah, it's great.
maybe I was coming out
Yeah.
calmer.
No, honestly, it is nice to connect and to talk to people, and we have lost that a little bit in COVID, I think,
Yep.
definitely, and it's it's really, really important. And I forget this myself, and this reminds me, it is so warming and but also important to talk to other people, and it's good to talk to like-minded people. I think also sometimes it's good to be challenged. So yeah, let's keep communicating, I suppose, as in our, I think I see very little on Instagram that is not about music.
Mhm.
And I guess
Yeah,
that's their algorithm, but that's also my choice. I don't really engage with anything that's not music because I don't want to.
yeah,
And I think that's a good thing. So I know Instagram has many problems, and I came off Twitter because I was just absolutely not supporting Elon Musk anymore in any way.
yeah. I'm thinking of
But
doing the same because
yeah,
it's a bit of a weird thing because you kind of when you're doing publications, like it seems like a necessary platform, but yeah, I just don't see the benefit of it. I actually noticed I lost like 300 followers on Twitter just from people leaving the platform. It's like, oh wow,
okay. Yeah,
yeah.
it's interesting. Yeah, and I know Instagram has its issues, I mean, they've taken away the fact checking, etc.
Mhm.
At the moment, I think it's acceptable. We'll see how it goes. But, we have a community, mainly people that I know and recognize on Instagram. And it's, as far as I'm concerned, at the moment, I'm kind of um, using them. And I know that's probably a fantasy, Aaron, but it feels like, I don't pay anything for Instagram, and I can use them to make my little community or our little community of like-minded people, and that works for me at the moment, And I really would just go back to what I said a few minutes ago. Bands in the main are delighted to hear from people. I know they are. To hear people just, even if it's just like, loved your latest release. Do you have a mailing list? Can I find out what you're doing next? Where are you playing? Just get in touch with people. Honestly, it makes a difference. It makes a huge difference to people because it's like, oh my God, people are actually listening to what we do. It's not
Yeah,
just going into this black hole of Spotify.
yeah,
And, again, I've said this multiple times, you're far better off having 500 or 1,000 people who follow everything that you do than 10,000 people who are kind of like, another release from Some Remain. Yeah, I liked that. I liked one of theirs before. I'll listen to it
yeah.
and then never get round to it. Yeah. So, yeah, that's, I suppose, what I want to say. Um, and I really appreciate the opportunity you've given me to spout off today.
Oh, absolutely. No, and I really appreciate you giving me your time. I've really enjoyed this chat. Thanks, Richard. Thanks very much.
You're very welcome. Thanks, Aaron. Take care.
Thank you for listening to that episode of Post-Burnout.com interviews. We're an independent venture run by yours truly, and as I said at the beginning, liking, rating, subscribing and sharing really helps us out a lot. If you're feeling extra generous, we do have a PayPal donation link in the episode description, but don't feel obligated, of course. We've also begun releasing occasional exclusive episodes on Spotify, so subscribe there if you'd be interested in hearing those. Thanks again for listening, and see you next time.